For those of you who've watched my show for any length of time, you've probably started to pick up on things I've been doing very deliberately. Things I'm trying to do to get across a little bit of a visual slash audio tint to my show, the kind of thing you're not really supposed to notice. For example, the intros to my actual ruminations are intended to be reflective of how I personally enjoyed the given work, regardless of what I had to say about it. And the same kind of goes for the backgrounds we've got back here. Snow usually being for some of my favorite episodes. And there's a few other things I do like that I put probably way too much thought into. But I mention that because some people probably are like, yes, I absolutely agree, this is a great episode. And some people are like, no, I hate you forever. This is probably one of the most polarizing episodes I've ever heard discussed in Voyager. No joke. And it's kind of difficult to talk about this episode without talking about why that is. So I don't even want to dive into this, but here we go. There's a book out there called Dragon's Egg by Robert Forward. I've read it, of course. I've read a lot of books in my years. I have nowhere to put this. You may or may not have read it. This episode is probably a copy of that story. Now, I say probably. That's kind of the problem, okay? In all of fiction, obviously, we're going to have things that are similar, and I have been a champion for years of the idea that you do not have to be a new, innovative idea just to be good. You know, it's whether it's a good idea that actually matters, not whether or not it's something new and exciting. And I hate the idea that, for example, Mario Galaxy 2 got pissed on because it was simply Mario Galaxy again, despite the fact that if you remove that fact from the equation, what you have is an amazing game. Very tight level design, very fun boss battles, very enjoyable, everything. The presentation of Mario Galaxy 2 was phenomenal. It's among my favorite 3D Marios. And yet it gets crapped on because it wasn't original. So I'm not really trying to go for that. But there's this big gray morass between not original and inspired by and ripping off. Now let's talk about these three things. So the possibility of a similarity, of having similar ideas, not being original, in other words, is commonplace. I myself have written several stories that actually are very similar to other stories with no knowledge or intention. I usually refer to this as independent inventing. In other words, I may come up with an idea, and I say I invented this idea, but I say I independently invented this idea to get across the point that I acknowledge that other people have come up with the idea before me, or other people may have come up with the idea, but I didn't know about that when I was doing it. I try to make that distinction clear. So even though, and this is a fairly common thing, especially in fiction, there are only so many stories as the story goes. And I'm not talking about that 5 stories garbage, which is actually not actually really true. What I'm talking about is the whole fact that there's only so many things in existence. You know, fiction is not infinite. Our creativity is not infinite. So we recycle ideas. It's the gravity of how much and how blatantly we recycle. That's where things get tricky. If, for example, this episode was made completely independent of Dragon's Egg, no idea about Dragon's Egg, then there's nothing actually wrong with that. Let's move on to the next step, okay? The next step is inspired by. I can give you a direct example. Several of the names and concepts in Primus were inspired by Acheron's Call, and I have freely admitted this from day one. And that's kind of the point of inspired by. That is actually the very purpose of that term. Inspired by means you saw something, you liked it, you took it in a new direction, you tried to do something new with it. Let me explain what I mean directly. Let's say you read an essay on, it doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter. Pick a topic that's interesting to you. You read an essay on that topic, and you are inspired by that essay to write your own essay. Now, your essay is one you wrote. You actually got down, took some of the ideas from that, and went in a new direction with it. You made something, even though the impetus was the other work. Make sense? That's inspired by. If you take another essay and you say, this is a great essay, and copy it word for word, maybe change around a few sentences because you're at college level cheating at this point, that's not inspired by. That's when you get to the rip-off category. And do you see the difference between these two? Most people who are inspired by something are very blatantly open and honest about it, like I myself am. And this, I'm not alone in this. Lots of musicians, lots of songwriters, lots of authors, lots of directors, lots of actors will say, my performance, my work, my book, my game was inspired by blah. It's a very common thing. I'll give you a direct example. Something lost. Deus Ex, the original Deus Ex game, the people working on that flat out openly admitted we were inspired by, and then there's like a list of 4 things. X-Files and Blade Runner was on the list. There were a few others. I forgive me for not remembering right now. It's been a little while since I did that rumination. But they flat out openly said we were inspired by this, and they took it in a new direction and made Deus Ex. Make sense? I still posit that there's nothing wrong with being inspired by, okay? When you are independently inventing or when you are inspired by, no problems, okay? This is my opinion, of course. The final category is rip-off. Now, there's 2 ways to do rip-off, and both of them suck. The most blatant and obvious way to do a rip-off is, say, to do the essay thing, like I said earlier, right? But that's the first way, to literally copy-paste it. The second way is to do so and not give credit. That's the tricky part right there. I hate to admit this, but when I was younger, much younger, we're talking like 16 plus years ago at this point, there were several things that I pretty much took and said, no, this is my own. And I have since, undone that, and I don't do that kind of garbage anymore because of obvious reasons. Because that is basically flat out ripping off. I didn't do anything. When I sit down, I get so defensive about my musical remixes because I sit down and I try to really work with it and actually do something with the song. I don't have the talent or the tools to really work with the music or to make my own music. At least I don't think I have the talent. So, I live with remixing. But again, it's always listed as this is a remix of blah. I don't try to say, oh, I made this totally original song completely by myself. You see the difference? Why am I bringing this up here? Because I've gone digging to try and figure out what the writers of this episode have to say about the relation of this episode to Dragon's Egg. And I have found nothing. That's a problem. Even if they had been questioned about it and said, I had the idea myself, or, oh yeah, I was definitely inspired by Dragon's Egg, then all problems would go away. They would just fly out the window. Done. You had a good episode. I do think this is a good episode, obviously by the background. And you were inspired by another work to make it. Sold. I'm with it. I would even argue that there is enough here to consider this a remix of the original story. Something that you could call your own. Something that you added to. Something you were inspired by. Make sense? But no one said anything. So I don't know if this was inspired by Dragon's Egg. I don't know if this was independently invented, regardless of Dragon's Egg. I don't know if this was a blatant rip-off of Dragon's Egg. What you think on the matter is probably going to taint or change your opinion of this episode. And let me make this clear, by the way. The parallels between this episode and Dragon's Egg are huge. That's the problem. That's the other problem with this whole concept of, the 3 points of derivative works, is the fact that it matters how much it's derivative, right? Like sometimes people will say, oh, well, it's not a rip-off. Some people will say, I'm not going to use an example. I'm not going to use the example I want to. It pisses me off too much. Some people will say movie A is a ripoff of movie B because there's like 3 connecting points between the two. Or maybe 10. Now that may sound like a lot, but it's not. 10 points in an entire movie you could probably connect to any other movie. In fact, people who like to lie or deceive or try to sell an agenda or are trying to do comedy by criticizing things will often do this trick. It's like, let me look at this character. Cracked does this all the time. The website Cracked. They'll look at this thing, and they'll compare it to something totally alien to it, but then they'll find those 10 connecting points. Usually they only go to like 5. 5 connecting points, 10 connecting points between these things that are similar, and then you start thinking, oh yeah, they are the same, when they're not! That's not how that works. It is a trick to try and convince you they're the same things, by making you realize that fiction is similar to fiction. That is actually what is being said with those sentences. It's ridiculous and stupid, okay? But that's on one end of the spectrum. And that does piss me off, as is obvious by my tone. But there is another end of the spectrum. Now, I tend, as is obvious by my earlier statement, I tend to be really, really picky with things that I will actually go ahead and say, no, that's clearly a ripoff / inspired by / whatever. For that to be true in my case, when I have to go into analysis mode and still see many connecting points. Lots and lots of connecting points between the two stories. Way more than 10. Unfortunately, there are many, many connecting points between this episode and Dragon's Egg, which again leaves us with the dilemma. What is this? It's obviously a derivative work, unintentionally or intentionally. There is no avoiding that. Whether or not you consider that acceptable or not, that's up to you. And if anybody else has any info I don't have, I mean, Lord knows I don't. I cast my net as wide as I can, but I'm not infinite in my knowledge. So if anybody knows anything else about this, please feel free to share. But I wanted to start with that because it affects everything else about the episode. In the exact same way that the essay example I would gave, right? If you read an essay that someone independently wrote of someone else, then you're more likely to, or at least I would be more likely to look at this essay and say, okay, I mean, you didn't know, right? If you did an essay inspired by the previous essay, I gave that example. Okay. If you copy the previous essay word for word, at that point it stops mattering if the essay's any good, because you didn't do anything. Make sense? So, with that out of the way, one of the things that I do have to admit that a lot of people I've talked to about this episode, one of the reasons they like this episode more than they otherwise would, is the fact that the concept itself is just one of those science fiction concepts. One of the things you can only really toy with in the science fiction, the speculative fiction genre. The idea of two groups of people existing on a complete time differential from each other is something that's been somewhat explored, but not that much, and is an absolutely horrifying idea in every way, shape, and form. To use an old example, I want you to imagine you walk through a closet door. That's a bad example, because you're going to think I'm referencing Narnia, and I'm not. Although I guess Narnia kind of did that too. But, imagine you walk out your front door, and you look up, and you're like, it's a nice day outside, and you take the trash out, and you come back in, and it's been 20 years. Now, that's an interesting concept, but maybe it's just me. That is an absolutely horrifying concept. 20 years is a huge period of time. Even if it was 10 years, that's a huge period of time. It's a colossal period of time. How much has changed in your real life in 10 years, How much has everything gone and moved on? And all of a sudden you're just back, and it's like, whoa. Hey, guys, it's me. You wouldn't even say I'm back because you're barely aware of the fact that it's been a decade since you've even been seen. You could see the horrifying implications of such a concept. I forget the actual quote. It's from Final Fantasy IX, and it's something along the lines of, "'Tis better to die than to be forgotten." And I like that quote, and I tend to agree with that quote. It is a horrifying thought to think that all of life has just moved on, regardless of you, without you. We tend to think of ourselves as important beings, and as much as some people will tell you that we are insignificant, ridiculously pointless specks of insignificance, yes, deliberate repetition, within the sake of the universe, the fact of the matter is we tend to define everything about ourselves by our connections to other people. That's the nature of who we are as people. Ergo, we are actually provably, functionally significant, if only to a few people. Now imagine those connections, those significances are gone. That's horrifying, isn't it? That's terrible. Imagine what it would be like if you come back and your daughter, I have a niece who's young. Imagine if I came back and she's a teenager all of a sudden. I completely missed out on that whole part of her life. What if she's in her 20s, to use my earlier example? Huh? She's already an adult now. She probably wouldn't even remember me. Think about that. It's further horrifying because this episode goes out of its way to show how many individual characters, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, don't really ever know the results of their actions. The people, the man who sent up the balloon, the people who sent the radio message up, by the time they had gotten that radio message, it's a powerful scene. Great directing, by the way. The director who worked on this episode was a really good director over on TNG. He does some good work here too. There's this great scene where the scene transitions smoothly between them deciphering the message and everyone listening to it in the meeting room. And the comment is made, by the time that guy's dead. By the time they got there, got everything assembled, got the message in here, everyone's in the meeting room, sit down, here's the message we're listening to, start playing the message. That gentleman has died. He will never know his message was received. He will never know that he spoke to aliens. Think about that for a moment. And there's several other examples of this too. What happened to poor the doctor? I don't know if he ever took a name, but what happened to the doctor's son, his adopted son down there? I mean, think about that for a moment. Your dad just disappears one day and you never see him again. And he never did see him again. Too much time passed. His descendants might have found out what happened to him as a result of the astronaut going back down. I can't remember his name, forgive me. I remember the actor's name, Daniel Dae Kim. Really hope I'm pronouncing that right, because I'm terrible with Korean pronunciations. He's a good actor. I have a lot of respect for him. He's actually one of the good extras in this episode. But let's go into the segue. Let's talk about stop talking about horrifying, terrifying things. Let's talk about extras. Now, this is funny because from my perspective, I've already talked about this. I'm not sure what will be in relevance to you, but in one of my recent Babylon 5 episodes, I talked about the relevance and significance of extras in television. I'm not going to repeat myself here. I already discussed it there. But Trek is part of the reason why that attitude why I approach that with the attitude I do. I feel too often, not always, but too often, Star Trek treats its extras like trash. I don't mean like literal garbage, like my trash can right over here. I mean like what we usually refer to as trash in video gaming, right? The idea of just random mobs whose only purpose there is to pad out the encounter. And there's a lot of discussion that can be had about it. You get my point, though, right? They don't matter. Just toss some random people out and give them a couple of bucks for a couple of lions, and there you go. Have fun. Star Trek tends to treat its extras, not always, but most of the time, in a similar fashion as that. I've actually already talked about this topic in part on Voyager. We've talked about the importance of guest stars and how a strong guest star can really help elevate an episode above what it otherwise should be. But the reverse is true. Bad guest stars, bad extras can bring it down. I say that because it's a damn shame. It's a necessary thing by the framework of the episode that each actor who comes on who has lines, for those of you not aware, an actor who has lines on a show is basically a different category of an actor who does not. The actor who does not have lines, who just stands there, is an extra in the most literal sense of the word. There's another term, I can't remember it right now, forgive me, of an actor who is not fully a guest star, but does still nevertheless have lines, and they have to be part of the SAG and all that fun stuff. So, yeah, you get the point, right? So these category of people, you need a bunch of them, and they can't repeat. Each person has like 5 lines in the episode because you only see them and then time moves forward a century or two. You know, you see the problem here, right? So I get that and I sympathize, but so many of those scenes would have impact if the extras knew how to frickin' act. They're terrible. They're really dull performances, and I say that specifically. There's a difference between bad acting and... I'm trying to think of a good way to put this. Bad acting and hammy acting. Some people confuse hammy acting for bad acting because some people don't like hammy acting, and that's fine. But hammy acting is usually a deliberate choice. You know, some people call it soap opera acting, for example. Bad acting is basically when you are not acting, when you are reciting lines rather than acting. Make sense? And that's the clear distinction here. And all the ones, with the exception of Daniel Dae Kim, who does a good job, he's actually listed as a guest star, but of course he gets more than 5 lines. All the extras, all the guys just doing the lines, are bad actors. And there's so much power from those scenes that could be there that isn't. The gentleman who wants to in a time when they barely have an understanding of aerodynamics, you know, sending up a frickin' balloon. He wants to reach out to this other protector. Please, you know, work with me on this. You get little window of this person's life and the fact that he probably spent the rest of his life wondering and working towards why they never responded to him. And maybe it was his fault for not reaching them. Maybe they just ignored him. You know, all these different things, right? Maybe he was ridiculed. Maybe he was laughed out of office and lost face because of the fact that he tried this cockamamie idea that didn't pan out. That story could have had impact if the acting had carried it. The story of the 2 astronomers and their desire to do something other than send a frickin' code up, to send a message from me personally saying, hey, this is what I feel. That could have had impact if the acting had carried it. Now, if you divorce yourself from the acting and just think about it in a novel form, in a vacuum, as an abstract, then yeah, there's tons of dramatic potential from these scenes. These little windows, just a flash of the story that we get of these characters. But we don't actually get anything more than that. The only character we really get any significant development on is the character Daniel Day Kim plays. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. He does do a good job with his role. He accurately portrays someone who is a weird combination of tenacious, brave, but still humble. He is very interesting as a character piece, and I very much like the fact that he pushed, as he would have had to, for his people to listen to him, 50 years after he's departed, that kind of a thing. That's actually very impacting, and I like the way that they get that across. And the fact that the episode ends on him, much older, finally seeing Voyager leaving, that was a nice touch. That was a great coda. And that helped show the life of one person, one individual, and how that one life was radically altered forever, for the duration of it, from youth all the way up to old age and his final years, by his interactions with the story and the crew. That was well done. That's exactly what I mean by the flash, and how we could have seen and how we could see more because of how it's presented. I'm reminded of Chrono Trigger. Hear me out. One of the events of Chrono Trigger that is one of the few really significant time alterations, and I discussed this in my in-depth review of Chrono Trigger, is the introduction of the Black Dream, or the Black Omen if you're playing the American version. I tend to refer to it as the Black Dream. I don't know why, forgive me. The Black Omen, right? Big old ship just kind of appears in the sky in 12,000 BC. Ergo, it's always been there, as far as basically everyone in the story is concerned. I want you to imagine for a moment what impact that would have on a society. Now, Chrono Trigger didn't analyze that at all. It had like two throwaway lines, one from Melkor and one from the Mystics in, I forget the name of the village right next to Melkor, the Mystic Village. Those two throwaways are the lines about them acknowledging the Black Omen's presence in their lives. And yet, I really feel that was a missed potential. I know Chrono Trigger is kind of a relatively short game, but the point being, how much would that alter life if there is this unending thing that is just constantly there? I say this because we in real life don't actually have a true equivalent of this. We have things that approach that, and those things that approach that have been a constant influence on our culture, on our society, on the way we've developed. Things like the sun, the moon. But neither of those are true constants, not in the sense that I'm talking about. Imagine if there was a moon up there and it never moved. Not once. It was a completely... I forget the term. I can't think of the term. It's when you're in orbit in sequence. So, like, in other words, the spot which you are in orbit over never changes. So it's always like this. Imagine what that would be like if that moon. Obviously, that I know that would have really weird effects on the gravity and a lot of other things, especially the weather and the ways. But just bear with me for a moment, okay? What if that was a part of our life? How much would our life? We already put significance on the moon and have put significance on the moon for millennia. Imagine if that moon was a constant fixture right there. It's always there, unchanging, unmoving. Let me go into the actual fantastical. What if the Black Omen was just hovering overhead? Much more obvious, much closer, not as big of an influence on changing the world literally. Not a big gravitational shift, not a big, shift of the tidal waves or anything like that. It's just there. But it's always just there. Just sitting right off the coast of Florida or whatever. It's just sitting there forever. How would that affect our culture? I somewhat recently talked on my stream about an alternate history, which I wrote and need to actually sit down and do much, much more work for someday, when I have fair time, about a world in which World War I never happened because of external influence. An external force came in and stopped World War I from happening, and therefore everything was different. That was kind of the point of that change. World War I changed everything so utterly and so completely that the world of today in that alternate timeline was basically a different world. Now imagine the similar concept here. You have Voyager up there, and it's always been there, and it's been causing these quakes, and you know it's causing these quakes. It is so interesting to me, the concept, stutter, of how much that would affect and change a history. And I do like the fact that they pay that off in this episode. They get across just how impacting it has been to these people to see that star up there. And as they get closer and closer to understanding it and working towards it and blah, 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 blah. And they do a very good job of that. It's also interesting because it is used as the Vulcan impetus. To explain what I mean by that a little bit, I don't think I've talked about that too much on my show, but one of the concepts of fiction, and this state specifically in fiction because this is debatable in real life, but one of the concepts in fiction is the idea that something happens, and this something is so significant that it fundamentally alters the path of a culture or a species or society or whatever. In Star Trek, that was the first contact with the Vulcans. The knowledge that there was alien life out there, the Vulcans coming down and working with the humans and deciding that they were worth working together with, and the cooperation between the two species changed everything for Star Trek. It's one of the most pivotal moments in Star Trek history, and I say that without equivalence. It was an impetus moment. It was a Vulcan impetus. Make sense? In this setting, in this particular episode, it is very, very clear that Voyager is the Vulcan impetus here. It is stated flat out in the episode that the mere fact that Voyager's there has forced their technology to develop quicker and more aggressively than it otherwise would, that they have had to develop along certain lines to adapt to the fact that they are under constant geological attack. There are hints that are not fully followed through on that the disturbances on the planet will continue to get worse to the point where the planet might actually destabilize to the point where it's not inhabitable anymore. And the people have been living with this and working with this and changing with this all because of that one change that was so impacting and so powerful it altered their whole society forever. It's also never stated, but kind of implied towards the end, that part of the reason they leapfrogged Voyager and became more advanced than Voyager was because they took they already had this desire and drive towards progression, and they had the time Voyager didn't have, and they took Voyager's schematics and whatnot down with them. Remember that? And then developed these new Amazo ships that could drag Voyager out and save their planet. I find myself wondering what would happen to that planet in the absence of Voyager, in the absence of that impetus, now that it's gone, now that they've succeeded after centuries upon centuries of this crap. I also find it interesting that the Prime Directive is brought up at all in this episode. Now, I know you guys hate it that I bash on the Prime Directive. Let me make something very clear, and I'll discuss this much more when we get to TNG and the original series, because I think it's actually better applied in both of those shows. The Prime Directive, as long as it's not a hard rule, as long as it's a guideline, I hate to quote Pirates of the Caribbean, but seriously, as long as it's a guideline, and as long as it is intelligently, thoughtfully applied on a case-to-case basis, I'm actually okay with the Prime Directive. My problem is when people just bring it up as an excuse not to do anything, or bring it up as a way of, or writers bring it up as a way to create artificial drama. Now, Voyager hasn't done that since the early seasons. Enterprise will do that a lot. Bleh. But the reason they bring up, I just want to say, I'm weirded out that they bring up the Prime Directive at all in this episode, because I don't think it applies in the tiniest little slightest bit. You know why? Several big reasons. Reason number one, simple morality. The idea of interacting with these people and saying, hey, we are not your enemies, please help us work to say, to not be against you, it appeals to the moral and ethical side of my very being. Rather than the cold calculus of, I will watch a species die, rather than raise a finger to help them. That does not appeal to the moral and ethical side of my being. That's the first reason. Second reason, a little more unopinionated. They've already violated the Prime Directive unintentionally. In fact, this is mentioned in a few other works of Star Trek across the whole body of Star Trek, that every now and again the Prime Directive is unintentionally violated, and now they need to work with that and work through that. That makes sense. You're not always going to be, especially as back in the older days when technology wasn't as advanced, every now and again you're just going to screw up, right? The other, as a relation point though, when you have already interfered in a culture to such a significant... I just finished talking about this. That's why I wanted to segue here. I just finished talking about how the Vulcan impetus here of Voyager was so significant it has crafted their entire culture and technological and scientific and economic and religious and everything else progress around this, around the skyship, around the ground shaker or whatever. they've already interfered in arguably the worst possible way in violation of the Prime Directive. At this point, it would be my judgment, in this specific circumstances, if I were a captain on that ship or someone in any kind of command, to say, now it's our job to try and rectify the situation as best we're able. We have already made things worse. Let's try to make things better. And I could talk more about the Prime Directive, but again, I feel that's a better topic left for TNG and the original series, where it will be discussed in more thorough nature. Excuse me. So I want to talk about something else here. Wait, where's the note? Hang on, I had another note here. Oh, there it is. I misread. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm ahead of myself. I'm ahead of my own notes. How long have I been talking before? I feel like I'm talking more than I usually do on this one. I have a lot to talk about. What do you want from me? I like the idea of the 3-second away mission. It's just a cool concept. They even flat out have it with B'Elanna saying 1, 2, 3, beam him back. That is a cool way to express the time differential in a literal way that the audience, that isn't abstract. Of course, the audience knows the time differential. We've seen it visually. We've seen these people progress significantly on camera. But that's a great way to bring it home. I've said it many times. You know, a million is a statistic, a person is a person, right? The Morden quote. I know everyone quotes Stalin, but I prefer the Morden quote from Mass Effect 2. You know, saving the galaxy is such an abstract thought. I'm saving my favorite nephew. This brings it home. We see her count 1, 2, 3, and then try to beam him back up, knowing that days will have passed. In fact, just about 3.32 days, something like that. I forget the exact number. I remember, I looked it up. They actually say the exact amount of time that passes in the differential. But that's a cool way to bring it down into a personal level. And also, it makes perfect sense to me that the Doctor would make a life for himself. I know that sounds like a weird thing to say, but it is very much the Doctor. The Doctor is not actually this kind of cold, calculating person. In many ways, he is the opposite of Data, despite the fact that they're on the same relative character path. Data, despite having things such as caring and value, nevertheless is very cold and very calm and very logical in the way he progresses himself. He is, in many ways, a next step past Vulcan. Whereas the Doctor is basically another step this way from Bones, of all characters. The total opposite of that. A very sentimental person, very emotional, very passionate, very energetic, that kind of a thing. And someone with that kind of a mentality and that kind of sentimentality would absolutely have tried to make a life for himself, interacted with the people, gotten involved with the local sports team. You remember that? That was a great scene. Robert Picardo, as usual, absolutely nails it with the role. In fact, there's a scene that I actually rewound it and watched again. It was very brief, but it was worthy of applause. Because it's the scene where he is beamed up eventually, and he literally lunges and just grips Janeway in this big old hug. That was so on point, because now we have seen personally, visually, on camera, the indication of what we cannot see. The 3 years that have passed. Again, hate to point this out once more, but 3 years is a long freaking time. It's not as long as 10 years. Because that's basic math. But again, to use the example, how was your life 3 years ago? How much in your life has changed since 2013? Think about that for a moment. It's how long he was stranded on this planet. So his just embracing of her really gets across how much it means to him and that distance and survival. Very good job on that. I love the political ramifications of Voyager. They only touch on this extremely briefly, mostly in the end with the Central Command, the change from it's never stated outright, but they change from a manned space mission to try and make contact with the ship to making antimatter warheads to regular launches of the antimatter warheads at the ship. You don't have to say it outright what happened behind the scenes. You don't have to say how the political landscape changed as a result of that failed mission. It's good unstated. I like that. And I love the ramifications of that. And again, let's use a real-life example. Let's say for a moment that we found a Constitution-class cruiser, would be, medium cruiser, on the moon. Do you know how much that would change everything? But again, let's talk just from the political aspect. How many people would want to go up there and examine it and just to learn and to grow? How many people would be excited at the idea of understanding greater levels of technology and research and science and greater ways to apply ourselves and maybe finally going out into the stars ourselves? And how many people would be seeing dollar signs? And how many people would be seeing, you know, the political ramifications of that? Well, which country gets to own that ship? It's on the moon, after all. Oh, well, now we have to establish extraterrestrial ownership. That's something that legally doesn't really exist right now in real life. There are bits and pieces of that that haven't really been codified into actual international law. But it would have to be, because all of a sudden there's something very valuable on the moon that everyone wants. And again, the space race, and the idea of the space race being renewed to try to get at this Constitution-class ship. You see how this could just, the dominoes could fall. I could very easily see, if in real life a manned mission went up there and wasn't heard for 50 frickin' years, that we'd probably shift very stringently towards a much more military application very quickly. I do, a very minor note. I do like how there's only two ways to tell the time distortion, really. Either you have very high-tech sensors, which obviously the people on the planet don't. Remember, even Voyager had some issues with that. Or you go through the distortion yourself. I find that interesting because the everyone involved on the surface clearly had no idea about the time distortion. And the I keep saying astronomers. Astronauts actually coming through also had no idea about it. They only started to theorize on it when they actually saw the people on Voyager frozen in time because of the time differential. And even then it was just pure theory, like, maybe? I don't know, it's one of possible explanations. I do have one, actually I have two. I hate to end this on a bad note, but I have two final questions which are kind of negatives. First of all, how the hell did they get on the ship? I know, they went into a docking hatch. How'd they get the docking hatch open? Like, is there just a thing where they can just say docking hatch open on the outside of that and slip their way in? I could believe them going through the shields. They're going so fast, relatively speaking. And we've already seen in Star Trek that unless the shields are specifically modulated, they don't really deflect, physical matter. You can fly through the shields. So, okay, that makes a degree of sense. But how the hell did they actually get on the ship? Like, that actually bothered me when I was watching this. Like, really? They just got on, and they don't even spend anything on explaining it. It's just, yep, we're here. In fact, one of the reasons for things like the transporter to exist is to try and prevent these things from being a real problem. That and budget concerns, but I'll talk about that when we get to the original series. Second thing I want to ask about, why... I'm only going to make this point briefly, because I've made this point before. Why do the writers of this show just insist on cheap drama with the damage to the ship? I feel like I just talked about this with the episode Dragon's Teeth. Oh my god, shields are 80%, and warp engines are offline. What? That was dumb. And Voyager, Star Trek is not exactly great about its tactical side of things. DS9 actually did that a lot better. With the war and all that. But Star Trek in general does not really approach it that well, and it always bugs the crap out of me when they do things like, shields are down, and they just keep saying, the lower and lower percentages. And it got to the point where they actually were saying, life support is failing, emergency power is offline. And then if you fast forward about 2 minutes, the astronaut played by, last attempt here, Daniel Day Kim, shows up and says, hey, and then leaves. And then they say, Captain, we'll have warp drive in 2 hours. What? You just portrayed the ship as if it was in life-threatening danger, and then shift to, we'll be good in 2 hours. What? Really? Really? You're just going to go shift straight from, we're going to die, life support failing, for God's sakes, to, oh yeah, we'll be fine to go to warp in 2 hours. And that's why I don't like it. It is cheap drama. It is basically, it's a combination of the red shirt mentality, which I'll talk about a lot more when that actually becomes relevant, and the reset button. We want you to know that the situation is dangerous. So we're going to do something dumb and stupid that everyone knows about, and it is not only cliche, but is badly executed, specifically to, you might as well just pulled up a sign, like, you know, those audiences where the thing that shows up that says applaud now. It's like this situation is now dangerous. That's all that purpose is, counting down the shields. It's like, okay, this situation is dangerous, and then it goes away because we need to be able to go on with the next episode. It's something that Voyager's had a very, very, very hard time with, in particular. The fact that damage doesn't last, and the fact that they're just, yeah, we're fine, it's cool. It's cool. Drives me crazy. But that's okay, because it's still a good episode, or it's a total plagiarism. Take your pick. Curious to hear your guys' thoughts. See you next time.